a PhD student in performance studies at the University of Alberta. She received her BA in music with a minor in LGBTQ studies from Colgate University and her MA in women's and gender studies from the University of Northern Iowa. As a trans woman originally from the United States, her research interests include queer representations in US film and television, trans history, trans participation in the performing arts, cyborg feminism, lavender linguistics, media archaeology, and fan studies. She's a spoken word artist, drag performer, and fan fiction author whose work often addresses mental health and trans desire. And last but not least, Lana Whiskey Jack is a multidisciplinary treaty Nehiwau skull artist from Saddle Lake Cree Nation. Her strength-based research and arts-based practices are influenced by her work and studies at the University Blue Quills, a former Indian residential school attended by 2 generations of her own family. Lana prioritizes Indigenous ways of knowing and being and combines them with Western academic methods. Her work is grounded in Indigenous ceremony and Nehiyaweewin, so Cree language, to explore kinship systems, Indigenous sexual health, Indigenous women's economic security, intergenerational resilience, two-spirit family support, and Indigenous visual literacy. Her current position as an assistant professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta focuses on reconnecting to the spirit of the Cree language and the Cree worldview of diverse genders. And with that, I will mute myself and turn over the mic to Alex.
Can everybody hear me? Awesome, thank you so much. Thank you for that great introduction, Simone. My name is Alex. My pronouns are she, her. As I said, I work out of the Institute for Sexual Minority Studies and Services here at the University of Alberta. I work with the Firefly in Schools program where I'm the Rural Education Coordinator. Our program basically goes into schools and talks about and explores and engages 2S LGBTQ+ terminology, identifies and analyzes effects of homophobic language and transphobic language, debunks some myths and stereotypes about 2S LGBTQ+ people, and identify ways to act as an ally in support of queer and trans folks and teach about rights and things like that. So a lot of my work as the Rural Education Coordinator involves going into rural communities and trying to basically find where they're at and bring them into a more ethical understanding of 2S LGBTQ+ issues. Having grown up in rural Alberta, I have kind of a home ground advantage sometimes in understanding the perspectives where people are coming from, and having family and community in those locations as well kind of helps me to go in there and take a look at what's being said, what's being done already, and try to visualize a pathway forward from where people are at and what kind of like discussions are happening in those schools and things like that. I'd say that my approach is typically a top-down and bottom-up approach. I go into the classrooms themselves and talk with the students about like sometimes the impacts of language that they might not be aware of. There's a lot of homophobic and transphobic language that's used in classrooms that people are not aware of. So kind of like recognizing where those students are at in their understanding of the impact of their language, moving them and making them recognize that in a way that's kind of inquisitive and hopefully fun and allows them to recognize that as part of our bottom-up approach. But then top-down is working with the communities, parents, local organizations, the school itself. How are they understanding these issues? How are they implementing change? How are they recognizing like the history, the inertia of what's been done and said at that school, and how that's impacting the current students, and how they're kind of being molded in an image that they've already seen, and how do we recognize that and the structural inequalities there? How do we kind of start moving beyond that, and then again, with the teachers, continuing professional development for teachers is a huge part of the ATA, and all teachers in Alberta are supposed to have a commitment to ongoing professional development. And I think that this fits in there really well. So often working with those teachers to, again, start recognizing what's going on in their classroom, why it's happening, and how do we move forward in that. Thank you. Not sure who's next.
Thank you, Alex. I'm unable to. There we go. Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing these initial thoughts, and I might follow up with some questions myself if not the panelists have questions. And I'm gonna turn it over to Xavia. I'm trying to move the spotlight on her, so to speak.
We good? Can you hear me? Perfect, thank you. Hi, yeah, Xavia, she, her, or Z here. Yeah, so I'm mostly coming at this in terms of like post-secondary education, so teaching in college classrooms. I also am, I've only been teaching for like 3 years now, and I don't have a degree, a PhD. So I'm feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome right now, but I think one of the things that my experience has sort of shown me is a lot of like how not to engage with queer people ethically in the classroom, both in terms of content and in terms of actual classroom operation. So I was given the opportunity to build an LGBTQ studies curriculum at a school, and one of the challenges that came with that was not just sort of the issue of choosing which texts and to provide the students and have them read and discuss, but also how do we structure the classroom in a way that is equitable and just, and how do we make space for the multiplicity of different experiences that students are coming with, and what strategies can I take as an instructor to foster a space that is conducive to this type of conversation. And I think one of the things that has shown, especially, so I'm currently teaching play analysis, so wildly different field, but one thing I'm sort of noticing is that whereas in a course about LGBTQ studies, you have sort of more space and leeway to grow with the students in their understanding of queer issues, whereas if the topic is sort of not directly about that, there's a different approach that has to be taken in terms of integrating queer content into the curriculum. Because you don't always have that same context and having grown together in this knowledge. So in any case, one of the things I sort of focus on is sort of building solidarity among the students and sort of trying to organize the classroom in such a way that we can have these sort of difficult conversations without re-traumatizing queer students who will be in the room. That's the end of my thought.
Perfect, thank you. I'm gonna move it over to Lana now.
Hi, Tanse. I'm going to show a little PowerPoint with my introduction. I always like including images with my work, just so you can get a sense and engage you more into my worldview and in my home, and my family. If I can, okay. So I always like to start by, in my language, Xavia A, that I'm continuing to learn and working on my fluency. Tanse kakia no wagamaganak lana whiskey jackanitsigasun onex kapone kotsenia. And thank you so much for sharing those Cree words in my introduction, Simona. So I wanted to introduce myself in my language to acknowledge the wombs I come from, because the root words for my name is and I am from is Utsi or Nitsi, my belly button. So when I'm introducing myself in my language, I'm actually acknowledging the wombs I come from, but also those who come from my womb. So and it also signifies my role and responsibility as a mother. And of course, as a scholarist, an artist and a scholar and a researcher within who's looking at diverse genders. So the biggest influence and motivation for what I do, of course, has to do with being a mother. I'm a mother to Emery, who was born my daughter and has been my son for the past 7 years. Who's went through many changes. So I learned so much how to be a better mother through him choosing me to be his mother. And so I have a great responsibility in that. And because of learning so much, it's kind of voluntold by my adopted brother, Dr. James Makokis, that I, as well as my adopted sister, Roxanne Tatusas, and my husband, James Lamouche, to start an Indigenous P flag. So we started one in 2015, not sure really how to work through that, because we were all kind of new, learning how to be better parents and educating ourselves. So there was a lot of looking at, especially within our own Indigenous or Cree worldview. So we took Indigenous P flag into ceremony, got a Cree name to kind of help us with our vision and mission more with our work. And that was in 2018. Our group now is called Okamau Kehaumigwanak, which is our lead flag that we use when we go into events or ceremonies, and so it again signifies the role that our diverse genders have within our ceremony and within our families and communities, and of course our nations. I come from sharing, learning a lot with my son through the rites of passage that our extended spiritual family has walked us through and supported us. And so we, of course, come from the building community and our kinship through bringing in mentors to help with that rites of passage for our son, of becoming a man, as well as the rites of passage we had for when he became a woman through his first moon time, but also through his transition into being our son. So ceremony is really important part of the work I do in teaching and sharing and building relations. And of course, the mentors come with gift exchange of teaching and imparting knowledge that Emery wants to know. And in reciprocity, he also gives back in helping them. And the importance of receiving his spirit name to help him with his vision and goals in life. And one of the most important also aspect of the language is incorporating that in his learning and teachings as well as in mine. And one of the most powerful statements through Emery's rites of passage that I have as a mother got to witness was hearing him say, Nia Oma Nia, which means I am who I am. And I always still get a little emotional thinking about that, him standing in his body and in his spirit of being so strong and so courageous. And so, of course, this is important for me to make sure that I'm always in making sure I'm in that place of honoring not only my spirit, my body, my mind, as well as my emotions, and of course role modeling that to my son and vice versa. And so in this place of being his mother and his father and, you know, these extended families, was searching out for elders who would help us with the teachings and learning our different world genders. And in this searching was finding out that as Nehiawak, Cree peoples, we actually had 8 gender views. And then of course, looking at some of the challenges and methods of using that, that I will stop here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lana. I'm going to now pin all 4 of us onto the screen so that we can maybe dialogue more easily. This is all Zoom environment is somewhat difficult to navigate, but sorry, I'm gonna need a moment. So while I am pinning, I'd be happy to take questions either from the audience. I'd be also happy to hear either Alex or Xavia speak to the things that were raised by you all. There's somebody who's sharing via the Q&A and just saying, thank you, Lana. That was really beautiful. From a Métis Cree sister in Montreal, I raised my hand to that beautiful sharing. So I agree. It was fantastic. All 3 of you. That was really wonderful. So what I'm sort of interested in, considering the topic and that what I said in my introduction, that all 3 of you are coming from different places and different positions. And so teaching, the word teaching in and of itself means something different, I would say, to all of you. So I'm kind of interested if you could speak a little bit more to that, and then maybe also to say a few words to what it means to be teaching ethically, more specifically, when it is connected to identities and identity politics. And anybody can start.
I can go first. Just to echo back the question, sort of our philosophy of teaching and how we're understanding teaching, and specifically sort of the ethical questions that come up. Okay. I think for me, the biggest thing so teaching in sort of an institutional context, I mean, there's a very long sort of tradition of what teaching looks like. But I also come from activist spaces. And so trying to merge those 2 understandings of education, especially of queer knowledge. I think for me, I see my role sort of as a teacher in that I have this knowledge, but I'm not like the authority on all things queer. I feel like, especially like as like a queer instructor, and so my visibly queer body already sort of grants me a sort of credence for anything I say. I therefore have to be very careful and deliberate about how I talk about queer topics and how I present this information, especially because like I might be the first and only trans woman they know. And so one thing I try to emphasize in sort of building this classroom dynamic of solidarity is that while I do have sort of this sort of long history of experience in the community and of studying it, that we are learning from each other and trying to make space for each other, not just as students, but also as people. And so in ethics of care, like not just sort of as like students and teachers, but like as people, and recognizing that, I mean, especially like in COVID, like teaching online, I mean, there's so many factors of accessibility that shape fundamentally how I have to teach this course. And so emphasizing that the patience with each other and the being able to sort of come to class as our full selves and sort of hold that space for those conversations. I think that answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Alex, do you want to add or share a few
Sure.
thoughts?
I can talk a little bit about for myself. So I did teach in Edmonton Public, and I've taught overseas in kind of a traditional classroom model. I left the profession because I didn't enjoy that model of teaching, let's just say. So I've always worked in education, but the typical kind of classroom model I found not very, it's so rigid and it's so old-fashioned, and it's just an institution that I think really needs to change in a lot of ways. So I find myself kind of working within that institution in an ancillary kind of fashion in my teaching. And I think when I go into a classroom, part of like my teaching ethically and the sort of self-examination of it for myself is that I try to make sure that when I go into the classroom, as little as possible, I don't echo those systems of power and that kind of institution. I try to make sure that the learning that happens when I'm teaching is collaborative, it's playful, it's exploratory, that we're making sure that these kind of topics, even if they are very heavy, that they are done in a way that allows students to kind of come to understandings themselves, which I've always felt is a much more authentic way of learning. And so that's part of it in that like model of just like the model of how I teach and thinking of that. And I think that that's applicable to any topic, not just the queer, trans, and 2S topics like that. But I think also when I am teaching those topics, it's always a very fine line because, as I said, I'm going into places where I want to meet people where they're at, but sometimes where they're at isn't a safe place for myself, for other people in the room, or even for them themselves. Some people, have a lot of things that are internalized that we don't want them to be digging themselves deeper into that as a way. So I think when I go in, I'm trying as much as possible to present those pathways forward in learning, to kind of shed some light on some ideas so that they're understanding kind of themselves and others a little bit better. And I think part of that is as we heard before, like just being a visibly trans woman that, you know, a lot of people might not have seen, I get to, I feel very lucky in that I get to take some of that onto myself. Some of those questions and examinations can be reflected on in me, and I get to be the person carrying that in a way, rather than other people in the room, rather than just throwing out like, you know, the generic, there are people that duh. A lot of those kind of ideas I can put on myself, I think is important as a teacher to be able to like carry that a little bit and present ideas in a way that relates to people, but also gives them an example, which can be myself in a lot of these topics. And when I can't provide myself as an example, making sure that I'm listening to like authentic voices and as much as possible, because even for the things that I'm presenting of myself, I always need to be mindful and try to like examine other voices with my identity. That, you know, I can't be the only expression of transness for somebody, of course. So making sure that those I teach understand that as well, I think is really important to me. So yeah.
Great, thank you. And Lana, would you like to add a little bit?
Yeah, as a, you know, a mom, and working in ceremony, like ceremony has always been this grounding to help with teaching a lot of teaching about the diverse genders from, of course, a Cree worldview. And so language is an important part of framing that. And it's interesting when looking at the teachings around the genders, it's not so much about genders, but the roles and responsibilities are what those genders are, right? So you have, of course, the different, you have your male and your female, and then the diverse genders in between. And each of those are, like in the Cree worldview, being an Oswell is being a firekeeper. You are the home fire, you give life. And so, but in between you have like the word, which my son is an Ihquel. And traditionally that was would have been taught the way of a warrior, and the warrior's the first law of a warrior is peace. And so thinking of that even that Cree word and that role and responsibility that he has. And so I've actually, in every course that I've been teaching in the past year, I've actually brought in teaching about when I'm creating the foundation for Indigenous ways of knowing and being, I always make sure I'm including those diverse teachings. And of course, bringing in elders and knowledge keepers and the community, because I'm just one voice speaking from one perspective. And so making sure that we're inviting those to speak to the stories of diverse genders is so important. And of course, incorporating art as a way of expressing, our skills and our, to show our expressions of who we are has been pretty important to the practice of my scholarship and research, as well as, of course, teaching. Thank you.
So I see a few questions from the chat. I added myself now as a pinned speaker. And one specifically kind of speaks to what you all three have addressed in different ways. The question goes specifically to Alex, but I think it can be extended to all three of you. And the question is about whether or not you can give some strategies how to help rural communities use a more ethical language and gain maybe some understanding of the pain that they're unintentionally or intentionally causing by using a certain type of language. And I'm thinking that can be extended to any type of community. And so, Alex, do you want to get us started?
Sure. So for example, the topic of language comes up all the time, and depending on the age group, I mean, we always want to be age appropriate when I'm talking about these topics, but I find, again, trying to allow the students to come to an understanding themselves in a way. So a specific example that we use is I do an activity called Where Do I Stand? whereby I have the class speak with their bodies. So we all stand up and I'll make a statement and have them move around the room to decide like where they agree or disagree. I always let them know, be safe physically, don't be running or pushing, but also be safe emotionally, and making sure that if you don't want to move to a place that's going to make you feel unsafe or like sharing something, then be safe at all times. But part of the activity is I'll ask like some warm-up questions that are silly and fun. I think pizza is great, pineapple belongs on pizza, things like that. But then start moving into questions that'll try and make them start examining their school and what they hear and see. So often I'll ask questions about somebody would be safe, emotionally safe and physically safe coming out as 2S LGBTQ+ in my school. And very, very often, almost everybody will move over to the agree because they feel like, oh yeah, it shouldn't be a problem. And then later on, I'll ask a few more like in between questions to like kind of separate these two topics. But then I'll also ask them, I've heard language such as, and I might like list some homophobic or transphobic language. I might say like, that's so gay, or don't be gay, or depending on the age and the appropriateness of it, I might even list some specific slurs that they might have heard, with a bit of a content warning on that, and say, I've heard this in my school in the past month. And I get everybody on agree. In the past week, I'll usually get everybody agree. And in the past 24 hours, I'll often get like the vast majority of the class will agree with that. And then later on, we'll do a bit of a debrief and I'll say like, oh yeah, so try to get them to examine that, like that sort of dichotomy there, that sort of, you talked about how somebody would be really safe in your school. Yeah, that's awesome. Like, I'm really glad that you feel that way. But also we talked about some language, and does anybody remember what that looked like how many people were agreeing or disagreeing? And then try to get them to come to that understanding like, oh yeah, maybe it wouldn't feel as safe if I was hearing that language. I'm hearing it all the time. Do you think people who are 2S LGBTQ+, are they hearing that language too, do you think? And getting them to kind of like get to those realizations and in different ways, helping that. We also do an activity about so for specifically That's So Gay, because very often I find in particularly rural communities, people will be very unaware of how that language is derogatory or how it's a hurtful phrase, and will kind of like make people recognize like what they're linguistically replacing with gay in their head when they say that, and how if you replaced it with a name. And I'll often give an example like, oh, I have a sister, and if every time I like something bad happened to me, I was like, oh, that's so Jen. How do you think she would feel? Do you think she would be like really happy? And kind of like, again, it's for youth. And so trying to make them start to recognize like, oh yeah, there's this connection there that you're not really aware of as a youth, like when you start using language in that way. But then once it's been shown to you, I think a lot of the youth kind of start to recognize that. And we get that feedback very often. We do surveys afterwards with the youth, and very often we get feedback like, I didn't think about it that way, or I didn't do that way. And I find that way is it's fun, it's playful, because we do like some fun questions that help us learn about each other beyond this topic a little bit, but then also specifically does highlight what is happening that they're not aware of, because that's very often for the students in the class who aren't 2S LGBTQ+, they might not be aware of what's happening because it's very easy to be blind to the issues that don't affect you directly. But I think that's part of that, the steps in making them recognize that.
Great, thank you. Lana, do you want to follow up?
So this was in regards to strategies or creating.
Yeah, exactly. Just sort of, this was more a question about the sort of like the rural context, but just to find strategies to speak to communities and maybe give them some strategies to not cause any pain, intentional or unintentional, because of language use.
Yeah, definitely creating spaces of courage to speak to, as one of my students said, versus creating safe space and what does that mean, and creating also spaces of courage so we can have the courage to talk about difficult things, as was mentioned earlier. And so it all, when we are looking at creating strategies, I find like, introducing who we are from different, in different ways is really important, and kind of looking at each other in different ways. For example, like introducing who you are connected through your belly button, right? From that Cree worldview, and being able to speak to that connection of because everyone comes from wombs, right? So it just kind of comes to mind when looking at that. And I mean, that's one of the challenges is when with creating frameworks is that when I'm coming from a very specific land and knowledge base and language base, and it's trying to translate that into English, because of course that's my first language and we're teaching in this way. And so how, and this is work that I'm still evolving because it is so new. And this is knowledge that hasn't been readily available or accessible for a lot of Indigenous people. So we're coming into this place of now finding that knowledge and the people who are willing to share it, so we can continue sharing it in a way of looking at and creating, coming from that very Wakotwin, those kinship systems. I went to a gathering, a rites of passage gathering, where people are coming in and their first, people didn't ask what their name was or what they did. You instantly became auntie or uncle. So that, again, that's another challenge of how do we shift our mind to think more of how can we be related? How can we connect on a more, spiritual, mental, emotional basis to building and strengthening relationships.
Great, perfect. Xavia, do you want to add to what's been said?
Yeah, definitely. I kind of want to jump off of something Lana said about sort of courageous spaces, because the way I sort of describe it in the classes I teach is an accountable learning space. So allowing us to sort of assume the best intentions of everyone and recognize we're all learning here, we're all here to learn, we're talking about some very difficult topics to even articulate in language, and being able to listen through the language used to the heart of what someone's saying, and also sort of one of the issues of language that I run into, especially in teaching LGBT studies, is sort of the gatekeeping of identities, and that this word means this and only this, and if you don't feel this, this, and this, you're not this. And so really critiquing and deconstructing the ways that language is not just a mode of expression, but is an institution of power. And what language does to performatively construct the reality that it describes. So, I mean, this is especially, if I'm teaching trans plays where if the character transitions halfway through the play, and how do we talk about that character at any stage of the narrative, and how do we do that in a way that is respectful of the character, but that is also clear, and that we can know what we're talking about. So all that to say that what an accountable learning space allows is for us to make space for mistakes and learning, but also to hold space for the consequences, however unintentional, of sort of language that is a microaggression or oppressive. And I mean, obviously, like slurs and bullying are not allowed, but like holding space also for students or even me too, who is harmed by that language, to say, hey, wait a minute, can we Can we talk about this? And sort of modeling that accountability in a framework of care. And that's the end of my thought.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And it kind of leads into one of the questions that is being asked in the Q&A panel about sort of, I want to flip it now. There were several questions being asked about sort of the role of a safe space in a classroom or an instructional setting, as well as sort of the productive role of discomfort in the classroom. And then there's another question, and I kind of want to go there about sort of from the student perspective, from a student perspective, sort of feeling helpless because of the ways in which instructors and professors share certain things in a class that is feels violent and feels homophobic and is clearly something that is disturbing to the students, and what can the students do in order to sort of generate a discussion or just address the issues, because there's always a power dynamic at play, right? I mean, Xavia pointed to sort of like language as being a tool of power, but also the dynamics that are present in the classroom or in any instructional setting. And so what can students do in order to address certain blind spots that are existing in the classroom or outside of the classroom within the U of A community or the larger community? Lots of questions. Lana, do you want to go first?
That's a deep one of, again, looking at language, especially I personally haven't, or maybe I have and don't realize, but especially when we're talking, again, another important challenge is when we have like historical trauma within classrooms, and when you're teaching, and when things are, if you're showing a film or that is triggered, being as, of course, as in the instructor leading in the classroom, is making sure that you're watching the students. And I mean, it's different now that we're teaching all online, to watch them and making, creating that classroom of care. And so I think about how do we respond to trauma, and of course in the ways in which I incorporate that, and is making sure that we have a team or mentorship with that we work with. Like I work with a lot of elders. I make sure that I'm connected intergenerationally with, those who are younger coming, so I can continue passing on my knowledge, but also working with elders and informing them, but working with them to help with bringing that, almost that grandmother or grandfather love into the work I'm doing around. And so feeling that, and that's where ceremony is important in because I'm working in Indigenous ways of knowing, is smudging, circle dialogue, which gives everyone a voice if they choose to share within that circle. And if they don't choose, at least they're being active listening. And we teaching those protocols within the circle dialogue, teaching them about the rock or the feather when you are in that circle dialogue, so that everyone knows the protocols and the rules of engaging within the classroom or within the circle of learning and teaching, right? And that reciprocity. So that's kind of like one of the many ways. And of course, art as being a place of reflecting on the triggers or the traumas.
Xavia, do you wanna? And then I'll call on Alex.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think one of the things that sort of struck me as you were asking the question is the onus that is put on students to be the ones leading the charge for hey, this text is really homophobic, can we talk about it? Hey, the language you're using in the classroom is sort of rather triggering, can we have a conversation? And if that doesn't go well, what recourse the student has, that all of this is falling on the student. And I think that one thing that we sort of as educators need to recognize is like that burden of making the classroom an inclusive space is on us. That ultimately, I mean, I can sort of like talk about sort of equity and inclusion till the cows come home, but if my students don't feel safe in the classroom, it doesn't mean anything. And so I think that what I think that starts with sort of I mean, educating yourself and also like being open to that conversation but also proactively analyzing sort of the power dynamics in the classroom and out of the classroom, and taking on that initiative of, but how am I sort of being exclusive in this class? How is the language I'm using creating unsafe spaces? And then also like in terms of sort of what is a safe space and sort of communities of care, like, I mean, one of the big conversations has been around like content warnings and how to use those, and the sort of accessibility concerns that content warnings address. And I think that I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so that if sort of the assignment that has triggering content is a required piece, that sets up a difficulty, a dilemma where the student has to choose between like, do I like deliberately trigger myself to complete the assignment, or do I just not complete the assignment? And so I think interrogating not just like the classroom as a like discussion group, as sort of a collection of people, but also structurally, how are we making space for these conversations and allowing for the possibility that students aren't feeling safe in this situation. That's the end of my thought.
Perfect. And Alex?
Yeah, I think a lot of what I was going to say has already been said there. But yeah, I think a big piece is, yeah, the teacher education piece is part of my work. I work with teachers doing professional development, with pre-service teachers here at the U of A in the ED 100-300 class, do a lecture about gender and sexual diversity. And we try to talk about like what the importance is of that and making teachers aware of kind of how those systems are affecting students if they themselves aren't already aware of that, which may happen. I often give examples about like my own practice when I did teach, and I do still sometimes teach, particularly with newcomers to Canada. And I think from that perspective, I think about how to build a classroom collaboratively is probably one of the best ways to address that. Like when we're talking about our expectations in a classroom, how are those designed? And I'll kind of ask teachers, like, what do you think? How do you just set those expectations in your class? Being bound by institutions, sometimes they're like, oh, well, I just look at what our school things are, and I try to give them some options or give them some ideas for how to start building that more collaboratively. And so like having students input on there, and students might need some guidance on that, of course, but like understanding that it is collaborative. And so when students say something like, we want respect in our classroom, that's fantastic. Helping them recognize where that respect would go. So, oh yeah, respect is great. So like, how do we show respect? And getting them to start talking through those things. And like, yeah, so we wouldn't use any like racist language. We wouldn't use any Islamophobic language. We wouldn't use any homophobic language, because, you know, students might say like, oh, somebody shouldn't feel unsafe. What does that look like? And kind of, again, designing it that way, I think can be a really great way. Another piece that somebody mentioned, or that I think was part of this question, was discomfort and the space for discomfort. And I think that's always like super, super important. It's one of like the big tragedies of teaching online now, is how hard it is to recognize that. However, like working with youth, one of the clearest indications of discomfort is humor, not always appropriate, laughing, things like that. Students and young people, I find, aren't given good tools for dealing with discomfort and dealing with something that is new to them in that way, that they could find alien or outside of their experience. And so almost always they default to humor. And that can be particularly difficult, because for them, they're trying to release that tension that they're feeling in that way, which isn't appropriate most of the time, which I find. So trying, like I said, I want a collaborative and playful classroom. And sometimes students think, oh, I'm going to release my tension with a joke. I'm going to say something, but that's going to be an inappropriate joke most of the time, because their discomfort is with something that I'm discussing, which could be applicable to students in the classroom, is applicable to me. And so taking some space there to, you know, have that, I think as people said, like understanding the consequences of what we say, but also understanding, hey, I talk about, you know, the difference between impact versus intent, and like why it's important to recognize that. And especially when dealing with youth who can't handle sometimes like being interrogated necessarily, but try to walk them through the an understanding of like why they might have said a comment. And I will like explicitly sometimes say like, yeah, it kind of feels like you might have been a little uncomfortable, and trying to make them recognize that, and that's where they're they're emotionally going, and like, oh, how are some other ways we can deal with being uncomfortable. We have a question and answer period, and we give them sheets to write questions on anonymously, and so I might say something like, yeah, if you're just uncomfortable, rather than like trying to let that out with a joke or saying something to make people laugh, because they might be laughing at somebody who doesn't deserve to be laughed at, let's think about, where does that tension come from? Where does that discomfort come from? Maybe write a question, and then I can talk about it at the end, because we collect them at the end. They fold all their pieces of paper in half, and we collect them and shuffle them up so we can like claim that they're anonymous, and then answer them that way. And I think it's hard because I have so little time with the students, and I think it's kind of, again, another one of those institutional failures that we don't talk with young people about how to deal appropriately with being uncomfortable. But in that little microcosm of my my lesson, that's generally how I try to deal with it.
Can I just quickly respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it actually has to do with humor, because humor is actually a tool that so many of our Indigenous communities use to actually talk about the difficult things. And so it's really interesting, like those different views around that, right? And I mean, yeah, if you want to learn a language of humor, learn Cree, and that's one of the ways of where we shake and laugh off of the most difficult things that we've endured historically, and of course within our communities, especially around lateral violence. And so yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Hi.
So I have another question that deals with teaching, and I feel like for the most part, you all have spoken to teaching within a very small class setting, or at least so it seems to me. And so somebody's asking, what about the large classes where you have maybe 250 plus students, and where some of the students are afraid to talk because they don't want to say the wrong thing, or they don't actually know the right and appropriate terminology to use. And so what about those classes? where you don't want students to be afraid of learning because they're afraid of asking questions. So that's the question from the audience. And my tag on is then, and what about the Zoom environment? What about our strange Zoom reality, and how, what do we do with teaching in that kind of world that we find ourselves in? And I'm just gonna, I guess, bounce it back to Alex.
Sure. So that is such a tricky one because, yeah, when I do the lecture for the EDU 100, 300, it often is a couple hundred students in there. Again, my environment is that I'll be in there for a lecture or two, rather than like helping to design and build like the classroom community. And within that tiny little context, all we can really do and what we try to do there is, I start off with talking about questions, how I love questions. I love the weird, interesting, fun questions. I tell folks, you know, I expect everybody's coming from a place of learning. But I also am very explicit about the fact that when they bring these questions up, that I say, like, sometimes people don't want to ask a question because they don't know the right terminology. They're not sure how to, like, they're worried that's going to be phrased in a politically incorrect way. And the questions that come up after that often are, but just making sure that they recognize that when they're asking these questions, I want to help them move past that question, and to other people hearing it who might feel like, I'm not comfortable even hearing that question. Again, that's part of like the luck, is that I can put that on myself and making sure that folks know that when those questions come up, I kind of like view it as like an injury that, you know, you cover up. You have to like bring it out to the light to heal it sometimes. Those questions and those ideas that people have, if we don't give that avenue for them to like express it and address, and then we can address it and talk to those like deeper issues that would lead to that question, then we sometimes get that problem of it just kind of stays there and festers in a way. And so it's hard sometimes to, on the fly, answer a question that has roots in, you know, injustice and oppression, and it's an incredibly complicated question, even though it might appear like just like a tiny little thing. And, you know, trying to like do the mental gymnastics of like answering that within a, you know, a set, you know, less than a minute amount of time can be very, very difficult. But that's, you know, part of the job, of course. And once, you know, you've heard some of them, you've heard a lot of them, and you can kind of like replay the script for how to answer, you know, for example, a question about a trans person's body. Like, I'll get questions about my body sometime, and that's a question that, you know, obviously the person asking it probably doesn't like recognize like how invasive that is, or the problems with that. And I always view that as an experience like, okay, awesome. I get to answer this now, somebody who's like intentionally putting myself there to answer these questions, rather than them asking it to somebody on the bus, you know, and who doesn't deserve to have that sort of like triggering conversation from a stranger. And so I try as much as possible to talk to why that's a problematic question, and without putting them in a place where, like, you know, I say, please ask questions. They ask a question and I'm like chiding them and making them feel like ashamed immediately, but to try to get them to like get to that place of my perspective of like, what's the problem with that question, and like why we wouldn't be asking that at the same time. So that's just like one example, but there's many times that those kind of questions come up in that environment. I'd say for that one. And then just for the larger question of like a large classroom, I think as much as possible trying to echo that collaborative classroom experience if you can. Teaching on Zoom is another complication on there. How do we do that? I think in some ways, because everybody's just like able to contribute and to access with, they have a lot more agency in how they're accessing the class. That gives them some tools to maybe learn in a way that's better for them, I hope, if they're taking advantage of that. But when you're building your classroom culture, I'd say still focus on those concepts of like, how do we collaboratively build this? How do we try as much as possible to remove those structures of injustice and oppression in our language as a teacher? Like, developing that. And I think it's also nice that you get the opportunity to kind of have some new ways of learning. I remember when the pandemic started, I was teaching at Norquest College, teaching link courses, which is for newcomers to Canada. And it was kind of rigid in how it was approached. But when the pandemic hit, we had like no warning, and it was suddenly a free-for-all, and it was scary, but it was also kind of exhilarating because they were like, you know, we don't know, the institution was like, we don't know how to handle this, put it on you. And in some ways, I mean, that's not really fair what happened, but it also gave me a lot of freedom to like start experimenting with how I was teaching with my class, which I really explored and I really enjoyed. So I think trying in some ways to view the opportunities in those situations and try to think outside the box a little bit and how we're approaching it can be helpful. I hope that answered the question a bit.
Yeah, that's great. And Xavia, and then I'm going to pass it on to Lana.
Yeah, and like sort of just echoing that, one thing that the digital environment does allow is sort of this radical rethinking of, well, so do we need an attendance component? Like, do we need a participation component? What does participation look like online? And sort of rethinking ideas of like, what does it mean to be engaged in a classroom space? And therefore, what that allows is for multiple modes of engagement and therefore other ways of connection with students that we might not have had access to before. The sort of flip side of that, though, is like that digital environments can be very rigid, both in terms of like pedagogically, but also like structurally, like that every time I log into Zoom, I have to remember to re-add my pronouns because it keeps deleting them. Or that students might be getting misgendered by eClass like every day. And so every time they log on to class, they have to deal with the fact that like institutionally, they don't have like already coming to the classroom from sort of this space of like almost impossibility that digital environments allow for some forms of participation and disallow other forms. And trying to balance those out in a way that is equitable and understands the sort of realities of queer experience is, it's difficult, but it's also exciting. I mean, I think it gets back to sort of like, so I can't really speak to like large classrooms because I've been sort of really fortunate to have like really pretty small classrooms. And so we have that ability to like have those one-on-one interactions, but I think that, I think that's the end of my thought. I think my brain just kind of gave up.
And I'm just gonna pass it over.
Thank you. I don't know if I was like supposed to wait for you to let me know I can speak or, but yeah, I think same with me. I've been fortunate. I'm still pretty new here at U of A of teaching in smaller classrooms, but one of the kind of creating protocols for classroom has been an important part of my teaching philosophy. And those protocols, of course, are the same that we use in our circle dialogues and in ceremony. And I often ask too, when we are going to, like as part of a protocol, when we are going to use our language, because in our Cree worldview, our language is spirit and our words are medicine. So are you using language that is used to help one another, or is it used to harm one another? And so, of course, we want to use the language in classroom that will help one another or heal or whatever kind of, you know, that brings that, that helping, you know, creating those kind of protocols is so important, as well as teaching how to think more critically rather than, you know, criticizing. And so that's some of the things that I've encountered in classroom is, you know, the difference of when you are criticizing versus critical thinking. And so, you know, in working with students, and I often respond like how my elders do, and doing those reflective questioning of back, you know, instead of step one, step two, is constantly asking questions. Like I tell my students, you know, constantly ask why, you know, until you get to the root of the thought or the idea or the questioning, right? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm cognizant of the time. We have about 15 minutes left. So maybe two more questions. There's one that I thought is really interesting. So we're kind of stepping away from the university setting and moving into sort of teaching related areas. And somebody's asking about coaching. And so, you know, a place where any LGBTQ IA2S plus issues are sometimes challenging to address. And so the person is asking if there's any wisdom that you can share about applying the knowledge that you have about teaching those topics ethically, sort of to the sector of sport or recreation. And it can go beyond that. That's just a question that's being asked, but I'm wondering about sort of stepping outside of the university setting in terms of teaching and thinking about it more broadly. And I'm just gonna put Lan on the spotlight again.
Okay, so I mean, my work is part of my roles and responsibilities, all of that. And so can you reframe it, the question specifically around coaching? And
so I guess the question is just sort of around sports and recreation and how it's kind of difficult if you're in the role of a coach and you're doing a certain kind of teaching, but that's maybe more related to sort of physical activities. So if there's a way to integrate the knowledge that you have about teaching ethically within sort of the university classroom, if you can apply that kind of teaching to, you know, engaging with other people on a different level of teaching, I guess that's my rephrasing of the question.
Okay. Yeah, I think about, again, coming from the Cree worldview is that, or the Cree language, Nehiawe is a non-gendered language. So, you know, even though speaking English is like, how can we look at the roles and responsibilities or the skills of where people are at, right? So I think of like one of our genders is like a contrary, those who come in and do things backwards, you know, and I'm sure many of you know some people who come in and they just kind of create a little havoc to switch the energy, you know, and so that is an important role and responsibility in looking at things differently. Sorry, I have someone blowing snow even though there's not snow out there. So it's like, how can we look at people's behaviors and their roles or their teachings through their behaviors more rather than a gendered specific, right, as male or female or that diversity, but how can we look at people's humanness kind of and what teachings they bring.
Great. Alex, do you want to follow up?
Sure. Yeah, that's a hard one. Myself not having a lot of experience in necessarily the sports world, but I would say a vast majority of what we've spoken on other topics is very transferable to the coaching. Or like how are you building your classroom can be talked about, and how are you building your team? Like how do we approach coaching in general. Like I understand like coaching is going to involve a lot of like knowledge transfer. How is that knowledge being transferred? Like what role do those you're coaching have in, you know, what agency do you give them in that? So like there's a piece of just like building a structure that's a bit more collaborative. Then how do we talk about these queer and trans topics in it? I would say thinking about what are the structures that a lot of students are coming in there already aware of, and what are they kind of redoing in those structures. So like a sports team that has a very kind of typical approach to masculinity. You know, often in sports we see a lot of homophobic language being used, and as a coach, like how do you address that? How do you stop that before it happens? How do you create a framework where you can talk about that when it comes up, when we're thinking about like respect and thinking those kind of concepts? And then maybe when you're teaching about you know, in your sport, like maybe looking for those queer and trans voices who've spoken about sport, like when you have a reading part about like, hey, let's read about this this sport or this topic, or like how to be getting the game sense and game mind. Like, is there queer and trans athletes that you can use as role models for your students? What can you, or for your what is not students but coachees? I don't know. Again, I'm not a sports person, so I'm bad at the language for that. But the people you're coaching, who are you putting forward as role models for them, and how is that being framed? Might be a really good question to ask yourself if you want to think about it that way.
Yeah, that's great, Xavia.
Yeah, and I'd also say like just so not just finding role models, but also yourself modeling is sort of the behavior that you want to foster. So like modeling, how do you apologize for a microaggression? How do you make space for these types of conversations? How do you self-correct? So even sort of modeling that that perspective of sort of respect and inclusion and sort of learning through each other. But also, I mean, I think specifically with sports, I mean, like sports is a very loaded field for queer people. And because of the way that some sports are structured, trans and intersex people just straight up don't have access. And so it's not only how are you creating that space, but also recognizing who isn't even allowed in the room, and what can you do to sort of allow for that those types of conversations, and creating spaces that allow for the sort of disclosure, if that's something someone wants, but even if not, that changing sort of the culture of, I mean, locker room culture is like its own thing, shaping it in such a way that is firm, but also compassionate, and that doesn't allow for sort of that queer phobia, but also recognizes that this is sort of a mentorship situation where you are sort of building them into athletes, and sort of what does sports person like conduct look like. That's the end of my thought.
Thank you, that's great. And so I think the final question that I'm going to sort of pose to all three of you is maybe not so much a question, but maybe sort of like a strategy or two that you could give to the attendees, sort of around, and now I'm kind of paraphrasing one of the questions that was posed around sort of not only having to deconstruct some of the materials we are using in class, or that are being used in class, or that we're bringing into the classroom, but also the ways in which certain ways of being and knowing have been legitimized and are sort of have been canonicized. And if you have a strategy or two, or a tip, a resource that one could use to bring in, to sort of undo those canonical ways of being and knowing, and of deconstructing some of the materials that are circulating within our teaching spaces. I'm just gonna call on Alex first.
I guess I'd say as like the one tip is read, find authentic authors, find folks with different identities in yourself to like try and listen to different perspectives to understand different ways of knowing. And I'd say it sounds like really generic, but honestly, that's probably the best that you can do, is try to like find those other voices and learn from them.
Perfect. Lana, do you have any suggestions, tips, resources to share?
Thank you. Yeah, you know, just asking yourself questions, especially as educators, is how can you build and lift spirit within people? You know, like thinking of, one of the things, especially as an Indigenous person, education has excluded spirit in our ways of learning and being. So how can we build spirit in one another? And I mean, there's lots of different books around that. So it's kind of doing that research for yourself of how do you build your humanness of your mentally, emotional, even emotion. Like how many places can we learn how to express our emotions in healthy ways that don't harm? How do we express and honor anger, right? Because of course, when you have a lot of unresolved trauma, how do you even get to that place of teaching people to honor their anger, their emotions? And so those are the things that education has kind of excluded, and it's exactly what we need to get back, especially in this time of COVID, when we are pretty isolated, is how do we connect? How do we evolve our language to be more of a language to help one another? Instead of helping ourselves, how can we use our language to help one another and lifting one another? As just a little, small homework for yourself growth and self-care, right? Of growing yourself as a human being and then teaching that on. Thank you.
And
Yeah, and also thinking through canonicity, even as we're deconstructing canons, any list of texts we give is always already a canon. So we might just be replacing one text for another. And so I think one important strategy is transparency about that process. Why are these the texts I've chosen to teach in this course? Why have I chosen these and not others? And also contextualizing those texts. So if I say have to teach, if I have to teach sort of a certain playwright, how am I contextualizing that canonizing process as sort of a form of power? And how am I thematizing canonization throughout the course? Even in my LGBT studies class, one strategy I would use is to sort of place two texts side by side that have sort of widely disparate opinions on the topic, and sort of teasing apart what this idea that there's always a multiplicity of perspectives, and there's always a perspective and bias that comes with any selection of texts, and doing that in a way that sort of acknowledges sort of the gaps in that canon and the sort of over representations, but also what are the pedagogical goals of any of these texts? Like, is it still pedagogically effective to teach this like super racist text, even if it is sort of foundational to the field? Like, what does that still offer something useful in the classroom, or is it just making things worse? That's the end of my thought.
Thank you. And I think that's a good sort of note to end on, to sort of say, yeah, what is it that I'm doing, and self-reflection, and not making matters worse as much as we can. So I really want to thank all three of you for sharing all your knowledge and your experiences with us today. This was a fantastic panel conversation. And I also want to thank all the attendees that were here, that asked the questions and post some comments in the Q&A section. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions that were being posed, but I tried to at least combine some of the questions that were being asked into sort of like a broader one in order to address the majority of the questions. And I'm just going to wish you all a wonderful rest of your afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you may be currently located. And I'm going to say goodbye.